Jason Cole stood in line at gate 32, clutching his boarding pass and a weathered briefcase that had traveled more miles than most of the passengers around him. It wasn't the first time he had waited in a crowded airport terminal, and he doubted it would be the last. His eyes scanned the rows of seats filled with fellow travelers, some flipping through magazines, others immersed in their phones, and a few nodding off as announcements droned overhead. When the gate agent finally called for Group 2, Jason stepped forward, offering a polite nod to the older couple in front of him. He handed over his boarding pass, already anticipating the relief of settling into his aisle seat near the front of the plane. His job as a corporate consultant often required long flights, and this time, he had paid a little extra for the upgrade, a small luxury in a life full of compromises. The scanner beeped. The gate agent, a young woman with a crisp uniform and a practiced smile, paused. Her eyes flicked to Jason and then back to her screen. "Just a moment, Mr. Cole," she said, her tone neutral but distant. She tapped a few keys, her fingers moving with the efficiency of someone used to small hiccups in the system. Jason waited, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Behind him, the line grew restless. A businessman in a navy suit sighed loudly, muttering something under his breath. "Everything all right?" Jason asked, keeping his voice calm. The gate agent's smile tightened. "It seems there's been a change to your seating assignment. I'll print you a new boarding pass." Jason frowned but nodded. Mistakes happened. He glanced at the screen, catching a glimpse of his original seat number 4C before it disappeared. Moments later, the agent handed him a new pass. "Seat 27B, she said briskly, motioning him aside to keep the line moving. 27B? Jason repeated, his brows knitting together. "I paid for an upgraded seat. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but this is what the system has assigned you," she replied, her tone now clipped. She didn't meet his eyes. Jason opened his mouth to protest but stopped himself. The businessman behind him cleared his throat. Impatient, Jason stepped aside, gripping the new boarding pass tightly as the next passenger moved forward. Blank. Blank. As he walked down the jet bridge, Jason tried to suppress the frustration bubbling inside him. He had learned long ago that it was rarely worth making a scene. He was a black man, and no matter how successful or well-dressed he was, there were always unspoken rules to navigate. But this felt deliberate, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. He reached row 27, wedged between the wing and the bathrooms, and found his assigned seat a middle one. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and recycled cabin air. A stocky man in the aisle seat was already elbow-deep in a bag of pretzels, while a young woman with headphones occupied the window seat, staring intently out at the tarmac. Jason hesitated. He glanced down the aisle toward the front of the plane, where passengers were settling into their spacious seats with extra legroom. His original seat. With a quiet sigh, he placed his briefcase in the overhead bin and lowered himself into 27B. The seat was narrow, the armrests already claimed by his neighbors. He folded his hands in his lap and stared straight ahead as the boarding process continued. Blank. Excuse me. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Jason looked up to see a flight attendant, her uniform perfectly pressed and her expression unreadable. "Is everything all right here?" Jason hesitated. "Actually, no. I was supposed to be in seat 4C, but I was reassigned without an explanation. I'd like to know why." The attendant blinked, her practiced smile faltering for just a moment. "I'll check on that for you," she said before walking away. Jason watched her retreat, noting how she didn't seem in any rush to return. Around him, passengers were stowing bags, flipping through safety cards, and adjusting neck pillows. Life went on, as it always did. Blank. As the plane taxied to the runway, Jason leaned back in his seat, his shoulders tight. He thought about all the times he'd been treated differently on the road. At restaurants, even in boardrooms. Each time, he had told himself to rise above it, to focus on what truly mattered. But sitting here, in a seat he hadn't chosen, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an oversight. Somewhere near the front of the plane, a child laughed, the sound clear and unburdened. Jason closed his eyes, bracing himself for the long flight ahead. The soft hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as passengers adjusted to their seats and the overhead compartments clicked shut. Jason sat motionless in 27B, his hands resting on his lap, the narrow seat pressed against his shoulders, and the faint sound of a baby crying a few rows behind added to the discomfort. He glanced out of the corner of his eye at the aisle, hoping to see the flight attendant return with an explanation. Minutes passed, but she didn't reappear. Instead, a different flight attendant moved briskly through the aisle, smiling at passengers as she checked seatbelts and collected stray carry-ons. Jason considered flagging her down but hesitated. He'd already asked once. Anything more might be seen as making a fuss. Jason wasn't one to raise his voice or demand attention. His mother had taught him, early on, that patience and calm could diffuse even the most unfair situations. Still, sitting here, crammed between strangers, he felt the edges of his restraint fray. Blank. Blank. The man in the aisle seat shifted, elbowing Jason's arm as he fumbled with the tablet. Sorry about that, he muttered without looking up. Jason gave a tight smile. No problem. The woman in the window seat remained absorbed in her own world, her headphones a barrier to whatever discomfort lingered in their cramped row. Jason envied her detachment. As the plane began its taxi toward the runway, Jason pulled out his phone and scrolled through emails, hoping to distract himself. A message from his assistant caught his eye. It was a confirmation of his original seat assignment 4C. Aisle seat, extra legroom. He stared at the email for a moment, his jaw tightening. It wasn't just a mix-up. The confirmation was clear, unambiguous. He had paid for that seat. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and leaned his head against the seat. The logical part of him wanted to let it go. He could endure a few hours of discomfort. But something deeper gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about what the reassignment represented. Blank. The flight leveled out, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Passengers stirred, reaching for books, tablets, and snacks. Jason remained still, his thoughts churning. After a few moments, he caught the attention of the flight attendant who had passed by earlier. Excuse me, he said, keeping his voice even. I asked about my seat earlier. I was assigned to 4C, but I was moved back here. Could you explain why? The attendant paused, her polite smile flickering. I'm not sure, sir. I can check with the purser. Jason nodded. I'd appreciate that. The woman nodded and moved away, her polished demeanor intact. Jason watched her disappear toward the front of the plane. He noticed a few passengers nearby glance his way, their expressions curious but unreadable. No one said anything. Blank. About 10 minutes later, the original flight attendant returned, clipboard in hand. Her steps were deliberate, her face composed in a way that made Jason's stomach tighten. Mr. Cole, she began, stopping just short of his row. I've checked with our team. And unfortunately, there was an adjustment to your seat due to operational requirements. Jason frowned. What does that mean, exactly? The attendant's smile grew thin. It happens sometimes when the seating configuration changes. We're sorry for the inconvenience. Jason leaned forward slightly. But the seating configuration hasn't changed. My seat, 4C, is still there. I saw someone sitting in it when I boarded. Her eyes flicked away for a moment, just long enough to confirm what Jason already suspected. She had no real answer. I'm afraid there's nothing more we can do at this time, she said finally, her tone soft but firm. We appreciate your understanding. Jason sat back, exhaling slowly through his nose. Understanding. The word lingered, heavy and hollow. He wanted to ask why the adjustment had been made, why he had been chosen to move, but the attendant was already walking away, and Jason could feel the eyes of the passengers around him, watching. For the rest of the flight, Jason tried to occupy himself with work, but his focus wavered. He replayed the interaction in his mind, dissecting every word and expression. It wasn't just an error. He felt certain of that now. It was something unspoken, something that wouldn't be admitted outright. When the plane began its descent, Jason looked out the window, not his window, but the sliver of view past the shoulder of the woman next to him. The clouds parted, revealing a sprawling patchwork of land and city below. He thought of all the other times he had encountered situations like this, small, seemingly insignificant slights that were easy to dismiss on the surface but weighed heavy with meaning. He wasn't angry, not in the way some people might expect. Instead, he felt a quiet resolve hardening inside him. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about the pattern. The accumulation of moments that spoke louder than any single incident. Jason didn't know what he would do next. But as the wheels touched the ground and the plane shuddered to a halt, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let this one go. The plane was steady now, its engines humming softly as it cruised at 30,000 feet. Jason glanced around the cabin, his gaze settling on the small screen embedded in the seat back ahead of him. The map displayed their slow progress across the country, a thin arc connecting departure to destination. It was meant to be reassuring. But Jason felt no comfort. Beside him, the woman in the window seat had finally removed her headphones. She was scrolling through her phone, her expression neutral, unaware or perhaps uninterested in the quiet tension that had marked the earlier part of the flight. The man in the aisle seat was now absorbed in a movie. His pretzels long gone, Jason leaned back and tried to center himself, closing his eyes. But just as the edges of his frustration began to dull, a voice broke through the low murmur of the cabin. "Excuse me, sir," the voice said. It was soft but purposeful. Jason opened his eyes to find a woman standing in the aisle beside him. She was around his age, with short cropped gray hair and sharp, observant eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her tailored blazer and leather tote suggested a professional background, perhaps a lawyer. He guessed. "I couldn't help but overhear earlier," she said quietly, her tone measured. "About your seat." Jason straightened, uncertain of her intent. "Yes," he said after a pause. "It seems there was a last-minute reassignment." She nodded, her expression neither pitying nor dismissive. "I've seen it happen before," she said simply, glancing down the aisle. "Not to me, of course. But to people like you." Jason studied her, unsure how to respond. The candor in her voice caught him off guard. But there was no trace of malice in her words, only a quiet recognition. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The woman continued, keeping her voice low so as not to draw attention. "My name's Emma Clark. I'm a civil rights attorney. I've been flying long enough to notice patterns. And I've seen this kind of thing happen more than I'd like to admit." Jason felt a flicker of both gratitude and weariness. "Jason Cole," he replied, extending a hand. "It's not the first time for me, either." Emma took the offered handshake, her grip firm. She didn't sit but remained standing, her presence calm and unassuming. "I've always wondered," she said after a moment. "How many people let it slide? How many don't speak up because they know what it costs to push back?" Jason nodded slowly, her words resonating more deeply than he expected. "It's easier to let it go," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean it doesn't sit with you." Emma tilted her head slightly, as though weighing his response. "Do you mind if I ask, did they ever give you a real explanation?" Jason hesitated, then shook his head. "Just something about operational requirements. Nothing that made sense." She smiled faintly, a knowing expression. "It never does. Blank. Underscore. Blank." Their brief exchange might have ended there. But Emma didn't move away. Instead, she shifted slightly, leaning one hand on the headrest of the row in front of Jason's. "If you don't mind me saying," she began carefully, "it might be worth documenting. These incidents rarely leave a paper trail unless someone makes one." Jason raised an eyebrow. "You mean like filing a complaint?" Emma nodded. "Exactly. The airlines are careful with how they frame these things. But if enough people push back, if they start to see patterns, they can't deny it forces their hand." Jason considered her words. He'd thought about filing complaints in the past. But something had always stopped him. Perhaps it was the futility of shouting into a void, or the fear of being dismissed as another angry passenger. But Emma's matter-of-fact tone carried weight, as though she'd been down this road before and knew the terrain better than most. Blank. Underscore. Blank. A subtle shift in the cabin pulled their attention away. The flight attendants were making their rounds with the beverage cart. the faint clinking of ice cubes and soda cans punctuating the quiet. Emma straightened, her hand dropping to her side. "I'll let you think about it," she said, her voice softening. "But if you decide to move forward, I'd be happy to offer some guidance." Jason met her gaze, seeing nothing but sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. She nodded once, then stepped aside as the cart approached. Jason watched her move back toward her seat a few rows ahead, her presence leaving an impression that lingered long after she was gone. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the attendants distributed drinks, Jason found himself replaying her words. Document it. Create a paper trail. He thought about the emails, the boarding pass he'd handed over at the gate, and the indifferent expressions of the crew. It wasn't just about him. He realized Emma had given voice to something he hadn't fully articulated, a quiet acknowledgement that this wasn't an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern, one that relied on people staying silent. Jason reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He opened his notes app and began typing, his fingers moving deliberately as he documented everything from the moment he arrived at the gate. The process felt cathartic, as though he was reclaiming a small piece of control. By the time the plane began its gradual descent, Jason had a detailed account saved on his phone. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt less like a passenger and more like a participant. The plane's descent began with a soft chime, signaling the cabin crew to prepare for landing. Jason tucked his phone away, his notes saved but far from finished. Around him, passengers stirred, collecting books, folding tray tables, and shifting in their seats. The air seemed to grow heavier, the subtle restlessness of the cabin filling the space. Jason's gaze fell to his hands, resting on his knees. He thought of Emma's words about patterns, about pushing back. He had always seen these moments as isolated events, annoyances to be endured, but now, with a name and a voice pointing to something larger, he wondered how many others had walked this same invisible line. Blank. Underscore. Blank. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "I saw what happened earlier." Jason turned to find a younger man seated diagonally across the aisle. His scruffy beard and rumpled hoodie suggested a college student or perhaps a young professional. He looked hesitant, almost as though he regretted speaking up, but Jason gave a small nod to encourage him. "It's not right," the man continued, his voice low. "I mean, I get the whole operational changes excuse. But it seems like, well, you know." Jason held his gaze, silently inviting him to finish the thought. The man shifted uncomfortably. "I've noticed stuff like this before. It's subtle, but it's there." Jason nodded again, appreciating the tentative honesty. "It's always subtle," he said evenly. "That's what makes it hard to call out." The man gave a small, almost apologetic smile. "I guess I'm saying, I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Jason tilted his head, acknowledging the sentiment. It wasn't much, but it was something. For a moment, the tension in his chest eased, replaced by a quiet understanding that someone else had noticed someone who didn't have to. Blank. Underscore. Blank. After the plane landed and taxied to the gate, Jason watched as passengers began standing, reaching for their bags and jostling into the aisle. He remained seated, waiting for the line to thin. The rush to disembark had never appealed to him, especially now. He needed a moment to gather his thoughts. As he waited, his eyes drifted toward the front of the cabin. There, in the first few rows, he caught a glimpse of the woman who had occupied his original seat 4C. She was speaking to a flight attendant, her polished demeanor suggesting she was accustomed to such accommodations. Jason didn't know her story, but he couldn't help wondering why her presence had been prioritized over his. It wasn't envy or bitterness that gnawed at him, it was the question of fairness. Why had he been moved? Why was it always someone like him? Blank. Underscore. Blank. When the aisle cleared, Jason rose and retrieved his bag from the overhead bin. As he moved toward the exit, Emma caught his eye. She had waited near the front of the plane, leaning casually against the bulkhead. When he reached her, she stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "I was thinking about what you said," Jason began quietly. Before she could speak, Emma raised an eyebrow. "And?" I'm not sure what to do yet, he admitted, but I know I can't just let it go. A faint smile crossed her face. That's a start. Jason followed her down the jet bridge. The cool, sterile air of the terminal washing over him. He felt an odd sense of clarity, as though the simple act of putting his frustration into words had lifted some invisible weight. But clarity didn't equal resolution. Not yet. Blank. Blank. In the terminal, Jason found a quiet corner and pulled out his phone. He opened his browser and began searching for stories about discrimination in air travel. The results came quickly. A flood of articles, blog posts, and personal accounts that mirrored his experience. A post on a travel forum caught his eye. It described nearly identical situations. Passengers of color being reassigned to less desirable seats with vague explanations from the airline. The responses ranged from outrage to resignation. Some sharing similar stories, others dismissing the claims as overreactions. Jason read the thread carefully, his frustration deepening with each comment. This wasn't a one-time error. It wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern, just as Emma had suggested. Blank. Blank. By the time Jason looked up, the terminal had grown quieter. The rush of passengers fading as people dispersed to their connections. Emma had disappeared into the crowd. But her words lingered. Document it. Make a paper trail. Jason opened his email app and began drafting a message. He addressed it to the airline's customer service department, laying out the facts in calm, precise language. There was no anger in his tone. No accusations, just a request for clarification. Why had his seat been changed? What criteria determined such adjustments? He included his original confirmation, the new boarding pass, and a brief summary of the interaction with the crew. When he hit send, a small sense of accomplishment settled over him. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a small push against the weight of something much larger. Blank. Blank. As he walked toward the exit, Jason felt a quiet resolve harden within him. He had spent much of his life brushing off these moments, telling himself they weren't worth the fight. But now, with each new story he uncovered, each quiet acknowledgement from others, he saw the truth more clearly. It wasn't about a single seat. It was about being seen. About holding the world accountable for the quiet injustices that too often went unnoticed. And while the path forward felt uncertain, Jason knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone in walking it. The airport terminal hummed with its usual rhythm of arrivals and departures, voices overlapping. Suitcase wheels clicking across tiled floors. And announcements echoing from unseen speakers. Jason sat in a quiet corner, his laptop open on the table in front of him. The email he had sent to the airline's customer service department was still fresh in his mind, though he knew it might be days if not longer before he received a response. He scrolled through the travel forum he had found earlier, reading more stories from people who had experienced similar treatment. Some were dismissive of their own experiences, brushing them off as mere inconveniences. But others wrote with palpable frustration. The posts painted a picture not of isolated incidents but of a pattern, quiet, persistent, and hard to prove. Jason felt a pang of recognition with every story he read. Each one was a reminder that his experience was not unique, that the discomfort and frustration he had felt on the plane were shared by others who had been pushed aside, ignored, or treated as less deserving. Blank. Blank. As he read, a notification popped up on his screen. It was a reply to a comment he had left on the forum, describing his own experience in brief detail. The message was from another traveler, a woman who had written about being reassigned to a middle seat after booking an aisle seat in business class. I thought I was imagining things. She wrote, "Thank you for sharing this. It's good to know I'm not alone." Jason stared at the message for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him. He had expected skepticism or even indifference. But instead, he found solidarity. It was a quiet acknowledgement, but it carried a surprising power. Blank. Blank. Across the terminal, he noticed a family settling into seats near the window. The parents were busy unpacking snacks and toys for their young children. Their movements hurried but affectionate. Jason watched as a flight attendant walked past them, her smile bright and welcoming. It was a stark contrast to the tight, practiced politeness he had encountered on his flight. The thought came unbidden. Would she have treated me differently, too, if I had been traveling with a family like this? He shook his head, trying to dismiss the question. But it lingered, a reminder of the small, unspoken ways people were categorized and judged. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As he closed his laptop, Jason heard a voice nearby. Excuse me, it said hesitantly. He looked up to see a young woman standing a few feet away. Her expression uncertain but earnest. She was holding her phone, as if debating whether to say more. Are you Jason Cole? She asked. Her tone polite. Jason frowned slightly, unsure how she knew his name. Yes, he replied cautiously. She smiled, a little sheepishly. I saw your comment on the forum, she explained, holding up her phone. I just wanted to say thank you for speaking up. I've had similar experiences, but I never knew how to put it into words. Jason blinked, surprised. I'm glad it resonated, he said finally. It's something a lot of people go through, I think, but we don't always talk about it. The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. It's hard to bring up, especially when people tell you it's just a mistake or a misunderstanding. But it doesn't feel like that when it keeps happening. Does it? No, Jason agreed. It doesn't. She hesitated, then said, I think what you're doing sharing your story is important. It's a reminder that we're not imagining things. Jason didn't know how to respond. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he hadn't fully anticipated. He nodded, offering a small smile. Thank you for saying that. The woman returned his smile before stepping away, her phone still in hand. Jason watched her disappear into the crowd, her presence lingering like a ripple in still water. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later, as Jason waited to board his connecting flight, he found himself reflecting on the encounters he'd had since landing. The young man on the plane, Emma's quiet encouragement, the message on the forum, and now this woman. They were all small moments, easy to overlook, but they had begun to connect in his mind, forming a thread that tied his experience to something larger. It wasn't just about his seat, or even about this one flight. It was about the quiet ways prejudice shaped people's lives, the subtle but persistent barriers that made some feel unwelcome in spaces others took for granted. And it was about the courage it took to name those experiences, to acknowledge them as real, even when they were dismissed as insignificant. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the boarding announcement sounded, Jason gathered his things and joined the line. He didn't know what he would do next, whether he would hear back from the airline, or if his complaint would make any difference. But he felt a quiet resolve building within him, a sense that speaking up, no matter how small the audience, was worth the effort. He thought of the woman's words. It's a reminder that we're not imagining things. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt that reminder apply to himself, too. The city lights below glimmered faintly as Jason's connecting flight descended through a blanket of dusk. He stared out the window, the quiet hum of the engines a soothing backdrop to his thoughts. The events of the past few hours still weighed on him, but they had begun to settle into something clearer, a sense of purpose. Though he wasn't yet sure where it would lead. The landing was smooth, the faint squeal of tires on tarmac breaking the silence. Around him, passengers stirred, reaching for bags and adjusting coats as the plane taxied to the gate. Jason stayed in his seat, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He wasn't in a hurry this time. He had learned to value stillness in moments like these. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The terminal was bustling, a sharp contrast to the quiet of the plane. Jason moved with the crowd, the rhythm of hurried steps and rolling suitcases forming a kind of music. He passed families reunited with hugs, business travelers making brisk calls, and airport staff directing traffic with practiced efficiency. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times. Yet tonight it felt different, more layered, more charged. At baggage claim, Jason spotted Emma waiting by the carousel. She stood out not because of her appearance but because of her stillness. While others jostled for position, she waited with quiet patience, her arms crossed lightly over her chest. Didn't expect to see you again, Jason said as he approached. Emma turned, a small smile softening her expression. Neither did I, she admitted. But I thought I'd wait just in case. In case of what? Jason asked, though he already had a sense of her answer. In case you needed a witness. She said simply. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The carousel began to churn. And passengers crowded closer. Jason and Emma waited off to the side, letting the crowd thin before retrieving their bags. As they did, Emma nodded toward the customer service desk in the corner of the terminal. You could speak to someone now, she suggested. They might not give you much. But it's another piece of the trail. Jason hesitated, his fingers tightening on the handle of his suitcase. And what if they brush it off? Say it's nothing? Emma met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. Then you document that, too. These things take time, Jason. Change doesn't happen all at once. Her words settled over him, grounding him in their quiet conviction. He nodded, and together they made their way to the desk. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The airline representative was a young man, his crisp uniform and polished demeanor suggesting he was new to the role. He greeted them with a professional smile, though it faltered slightly as Jason explained the situation. I see, the representative said after a pause. He glanced at his computer screen, his fingers tapping nervously at the keyboard. I'll have to look into this. It may take some time. Jason watched him carefully. The man's tone wasn't dismissive, but it carried a hint of discomfort, as though he were navigating unfamiliar terrain. Jason knew that feeling all too well, the careful dance of someone trying to avoid saying the wrong thing. I understand, Jason said evenly, but I'd like a record of this complaint. And I'd like to know what steps the airline will take to address it. The representative hesitated, then nodded. Of course. I'll make sure it's documented. Emma stood a step behind Jason, her presence silent but steady. Jason glanced back at her briefly, drawing strength from her quiet support. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As they left the desk, Jason felt a strange mix of emotions: frustration at the lack of immediate resolution, but also a quiet sense of accomplishment. He had taken a step, small though it might have been. You did the right thing, Emma said as they walked toward the exit. Jason glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You seem pretty sure of that. I am, she said simply. These moments matter, even when they don't feel like it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. The night air outside was cool, a welcome contrast to the stuffy terminal. Jason paused near the curb, taking a deep breath. Emma stopped beside him, her hands tucked into her pockets. Do you ever get tired of it? Jason asked suddenly, fighting these battles, knowing how long they take. Emma considered his question for a moment before answering. Of course, she said honestly, but then I remember why I do it. Because not fighting means accepting. And I'm not willing to do that. Jason nodded slowly, her words settling into the quiet spaces of his mind. They stood there for a moment, two strangers bound by an unspoken understanding. When Emma finally stepped away to hail a cab, she looked back at Jason one last time. Keep going, she said, even when it feels small. Jason watched her leave, her words lingering long after she disappeared into the night. As he made his way to his own ride, he felt the weight of her advice and the weight of the road ahead. It wasn't an easy path, but it was one he felt ready to walk. The light drizzle outside Jason's office window blurred the view of the bustling city streets below. His desk was neatly arranged, but the folder in front of him stood out, a growing collection of emails, notes, and screenshots documenting the events of the flight. He had spent the last week compiling everything, piece by piece, unsure of where it would lead but determined to follow through. Jason leaned back in his chair, his eyes scanning the latest response from the airline's customer service team. It was polite but vague, filled with generic assurances that feedback was being reviewed, and appropriate steps would be taken. He had expected as much. Yet the lack of specifics stung. It was a reminder of how easily issues like this could be swept aside. Still, he wasn't alone anymore. The forum where he had shared his story had grown into a thread of dozens of comments. Travelers from across the country, some who had faced similar situations, others simply offering support, had joined the conversation. For the first time, Jason felt like his voice wasn't just echoing into the void. Blank. Underscore. blank. That afternoon, Jason received a call from Emma. Her voice, calm and steady as ever, carried a hint of encouragement. I've been thinking about your case, she said. There's a civil rights group I work with sometimes. They focus on discrimination in public spaces, airlines included. If you're interested, I can connect you with them. Jason hesitated, the weight of the offer settling over him. He had never seen himself as the kind of person to take on a public fight. He preferred to work quietly, solving problems without drawing attention. But this wasn't just about him anymore. All right, he said finally. Let's do it. Emma's approval was almost tangible through the phone. Good. I'll send you their contact information. They can help you figure out the next steps. Blank. Blank. A week later, Jason sat in a conference room at the group's office. A modest space tucked into an unassuming building downtown. Across the table sat two advocates. A middle-aged man named David and a younger woman named Sophia. Both listened intently as Jason recounted his experience, their expressions shifting between frustration and quiet resolve. When he finished, David leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. This isn't unusual, he said. Airlines don't like to admit it. But these patterns exist. We've seen it before, reassigning passengers without explanation. Vague policies that seem to target specific groups. It's subtle, but it's there. Sophia nodded in agreement. The challenge is proving it. They'll argue it was a one-time error or a misunderstanding. But if we can show a pattern, a series of similar incidents, it becomes harder to deny. Jason listened carefully, his thoughts racing. So what do we do? He asked. We start by gathering more stories, Sophia said. We'll reach out to others who've had similar experiences. If enough people are willing to come forward, we can build a stronger case. David added. And in the meantime, we'll file a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation. It's not a fast process, but it's a necessary step. Blank. As the meeting wrapped up, Jason felt a mix of emotions: hope, uncertainty, and a faint flicker of determination. He didn't know how far this would go, but the idea of turning his frustration into action felt empowering. Before he left, Sophia handed him a folder filled with resources, templates for complaints, examples of past cases, and contact information for others who might be willing to share their stories. You're not alone in this, she said gently. It might feel like a small step, but it matters. Jason nodded, her words resonating deeply. He had spent so long brushing off moments like these, telling himself they weren't worth the fight. But now, he saw them differently, not as isolated frustrations but as part of something larger. Something that deserved to be challenged. That evening, Jason sat at his kitchen table, the folder spread out before him. The rain outside had picked up, a steady rhythm against the windows. He flipped through the pages, pausing on a template for a public statement. The thought of sharing his story more widely made him uneasy, but he couldn't deny the impact it might have. He opened his laptop and began drafting a post. The words came slowly at first, but as he wrote, they began to flow more easily. He described the flight, the reassignment, the vague explanations. He acknowledged the doubts he had felt, the urge to let it go, and the realization that staying silent only allowed the pattern to continue. When he finished, he read the post twice before hitting send. It wasn't polished, but it was honest, and for Jason, that was enough. The response came quickly. Within hours, comments began appearing, some from strangers, others from people who had experienced similar treatment. One woman wrote about being reassigned from first class to economy despite having a confirmed ticket. Another man shared a story about being questioned repeatedly at the gate despite holding a valid boarding pass. Jason read each comment carefully, his resolve deepening with every word. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was bigger than him, bigger than any one flight or incident. And while the path ahead was uncertain, he felt a quiet confidence growing within him. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt like his voice was part of something larger, a ripple in the water, pushing toward change. The conference room buzzed with quiet energy. Jason sat at the edge of the polished table, his hands resting calmly before him. Across the room were representatives from the airline, a senior manager with a carefully neutral expression, a legal advisor, and a public relations officer who offered polite smiles but avoided prolonged eye contact. To Jason's left sat Emma, steady and composed, and Sophia, who had led much of the formal advocacy effort. The air was thick with anticipation. But Jason felt remarkably calm. This was the moment he had been working toward, not a victory necessarily, but a chance to be heard. Blank. Blank. The airline manager cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice measured and diplomatic. Mr. Cole, first let me thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. We take these concerns very seriously. And I want to assure you that we've reviewed the details thoroughly. Jason listened, his expression impassive. The words were rehearsed, carefully chosen to acknowledge the issue without fully admitting fault. But what came next was unexpected. After reviewing internal policies and recent seating assignments, we've identified areas where our procedures may have unintentionally disadvantaged certain passengers. We are committed to making changes to ensure fairness moving forward. Jason blinked, caught off guard by the admission. He had prepared himself for deflection, for excuses cloaked in bureaucratic language. Instead, they were acknowledging the problem, if only in vague terms. Blank. Sophia leaned forward, her tone professional but firm. We appreciate your willingness to review your policies. However, it's important that these changes are transparent and measurable. What steps will you be taking to ensure this doesn't happen again? The manager nodded, glancing at the legal advisor before responding. We're implementing new training protocols for our staff, focusing on unconscious bias and equitable customer service. Additionally, we're updating our seating algorithms to prevent unnecessary reassignments without clear justification. Finally, we'll establish a more robust system for addressing passenger complaints related to these issues. Jason listened carefully, weighing each point. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. For years, he had told himself that speaking up wouldn't make a difference, that systems like these were too entrenched to change. Yet here he was, hearing the beginnings of accountability. After the meeting, Jason and Emma walked out into the crisp afternoon air. Sophia had stayed behind to finalize paperwork, leaving the two of them alone. They paused near the building's entrance, the city bustling around them. You handled that well, Emma said. Her tone was matter of fact, but there was a hint of warmth in her smile. Jason shrugged slightly. It's a step, he said, but there's still a long way to go. There always is, Emma replied, but steps like these matter more than people think. You've opened a door, Jason. Others will walk through it because of you. Jason considered her words. He hadn't sought this role, hadn't wanted to be a symbol or a spokesperson. He was just a man who had decided, finally, that enough was enough. But if his actions helped others, if they inspired even a small ripple of change, then perhaps it had all been worth it. Over the next few weeks, Jason watched as the airline began to roll out its promised changes. The civil rights group helped monitor their progress, holding them accountable at every step. Passengers began sharing stories of improved experiences, of being treated with dignity and fairness. It wasn't perfect, and there were still setbacks, but the momentum was undeniable. Jason's own life returned to a quieter rhythm. He went back to his work, his travels, and his routines, but something had shifted within him. He carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence born from knowing he had made a difference, however small, in a world that often felt resistant to change. One evening, as Jason sat in his apartment, he received an email from a young woman who had read about his case online. She wrote about her own experiences with subtle discrimination, about the times she had stayed silent because she didn't think her voice would matter. But when I read your story, she wrote, I realized that silence is what keeps things from changing. Thank you for showing me that speaking up is worth it. Jason read the email twice, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had started this journey feeling isolated, unsure if his actions would have any impact. Now, he saw the ripples spreading outward, touching lives he would never meet. blank. The next time Jason boarded a plane, he carried the same briefcase, the same calm demeanor, but as he handed over his boarding pass and walked to his seat 4C, just as it had been originally assigned, he felt a quiet sense of resolution. The changes weren't sweeping or immediate, but they were real, and for Jason, that was enough. He had taken a step, and in doing so, he had proved that even the smallest voices could make themselves heard in a world that often tried to silence them. As the plane lifted into the sky, Jason gazed out the window, watching the clouds blur into a canvas of soft light. For the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope.